Welcome everybody to Bike Talk. It's so wonderful to have Rachel Aldred here. And let me just read her bio, just the little version because it's long and she's been at this for a while. So Rachel is the professor of transport at the University of Westminster and director of the Active Travel Academy. She also teaches on Westminster's MSc Transport Planning and Management. Her site, rachelaldred.org, is meant to bring together her various academic research and policy interests. And these days she is putting quite a bit of stuff instead on the Active Travel Academy website. That came from something that I kind of pulled off the web, so Rachel can correct me if that's wrong. But also I wanted to say, Rachel and I met on Twitter, and she's fantastic there. So anybody who's listening to this who doesn't already follow her on Twitter, she is the source. She is a resource, and she is wonderful and engaging. So welcome to Bike Talk, Rachel.
Thanks, Andrea. Great to be here.
So you have done incredible work, and there's lots of research. And again, I point people to your websites, which I'll include in the show notes. Incredible stuff and really interesting. But I don't want to go into details because I'm not the wonky person that maybe, academic audiences used to working with. But I, from my really kind of broad climate influence background, would love to hear your perspective on where the UK started, kind of when you first got into your work and where it is now. And then we'll get into some other topics.
Sure. So I've been, as you alluded to, I've been working in this field for a little while now. It's looking back, it was 2008 that I first did my first kind of cycling research project. So it's been a little while, and 2008 coincidentally was when the UK's previous cycle infrastructure design guidance was published, and it was kind of notorious for having a picture on the front of a tooled up guy in a bus lane being overtaken by an HGV and really looking like the kind of cycling environment that most people would not like to be in. And that was the cover of our cycle infrastructure design guidance. And really that kind of, it epitomized everything that was sort of wrong about our approach and who we were building for. And, last year it was actually replaced by new cycle infrastructure design guidance that is much more inclusive and has been the result of a lot of people over a number of years sort of working together, advocate, policymakers, practitioners, academics, and so on. So working together to say, well, we shouldn't be planning for the cycling that currently exists in what is a really quite hostile, scary environment. We should be planning for the kind of cycling we want to have, which would be much more diverse and many more people would have the opportunity to cycle. So yeah, that's over 12 years basically. And, we have an awful long way to go, and certainly behind a lot of other countries in Europe and in the rest of the world. But I think having that guidance down that now says, we are building, we have to think about cycling inclusivity, we have to think about disabled cyclists, we have to think about women and children. We are not just building for a 30-year-old guy in lycra. Those people are important too, but we're building for a range of people. So that for me is quite an important change. Of course, cycling in most parts of the UK, it's still a pretty hostile and unpleasant experience, unfortunately, although we have seen some changes. We do have some good examples, and I think there's always been quite a thriving, or certainly over the past decade, been really quite a thriving cycling research scene, which has been exciting and interdisciplinary, which has always been kind of interesting because, in a sense, being a country that is not that good at cycling, but actually has quite a lot of really interesting cycling research.
That's incredible. I mean, I guess one of my first questions is, so what's the cover photo for the newer plan?
It's actually a bit boring. It's not a photo at all, which I think is partly expressive of the fact that, it's actually quite hard to agree. I'm just actually, hopefully that doesn't make too loud a clicking noise in the background, but I'm just looking for it so that I can, basically it's just a kind of green arrow. It's not a photo at all. So I guess they were a little bit nervous about settling on a photo for the cover, but there's a lot of really good pictures and diagrams therein, which give you quite a wide spectrum, because one of the things that I think is important is providing that diversity of imagery. And I think that's something that in London, Transport for London has got quite good at. And the idea that, you do not, when you're putting images of a new bike route out to consultation, using lots and lots of images of this guy in lycra on a racing bike is really, it doesn't give the right message, does it? And it doesn't suggest that this is something for everyone. And, now they're very good, and increasingly authorities are very good at showing a range of types of cyclists and showing, illustrating that, okay, if we are building quality infrastructure, we do expect to see children, we do expect to see older people, we expect, this is more what it will look like.
Well, I think, and the other thing that you said that it's so obvious, but even in my communication strategy, kind of watching stuff, that we are looking at cycling as we want it to be, not as it is. And that line, it's so interesting because everywhere I look, and even with a lot of bike brands and stuff, it still is a lot of men, and maybe they're adding different ethnicities into the mix or whatever. And it is all about lycra. Even when I have conversations with people generally, they're like, well, what kit do you wear? I'm like, I don't even know what a kit is, right? Because I do, daily riding in the city, but I also do I do weekend longer rides, and I do wear a pair of lycra bike shorts when I do that. But it's just really interesting. But back to that, like cycling as it is and cycling is where we want it to be. I think in climate change, that's always, it's always like just visualize and dream and anticipate and intend for what it will be.
I think that's really important. And one of the things that I think, when we're thinking about, quite radical transformative policies that are going to make it a little bit harder to use a car, that are going to reallocate space from cars to walking and cycling, it is really important to communicate an image of this positive change and the things that people will gain. Not just it's going to be a little bit harder for you to park your car, but just also think about the benefits, think about the transformation, think about the additional possibilities as well, I think.
Well, it's interesting. One of the things that I keep realizing, and you probably, I don't know if you realize this or not, but the people in the US are like, well, I'm going to Europe. It's going to be so great, da, da, da. And they take all these pictures, and the pictures they're taking are of the wonderful streets that are probably closed or have very little traffic and people walking and biking and all this stuff. And I'm always thinking, okay, then you come home and you park your literally in the US, they've got 2 and 3 huge cars parked on the street. And then they wonder why they have to keep going to Europe or the UK, to do this. And I am fascinated by that.
I know. There is a sense of, we have this here as well, because, people from the UK visiting countries like the Netherlands, where things, or historic centres of Spanish cities where often they're pedestrianised and they're really, quite nice in terms of low amounts of motor traffic. And then, it's easy to come back and just sort of, okay, that was lovely, but that was over there. We even see it within London in terms of London boroughs, that people will say, well, that's Hackney, in our London borough, that's not possible. And it's, even if it's a borough like 5 miles down the road. So it is often, I think it's hard for people to imagine change, and change often seems quite scary and threatening, because very often we do experience change being things getting worse. So it is, I do think, having that narrative and being able to also test out things being different and trial things and experiment, I think is also important, so that people can see whether the world ends or whether actually things get better, and some things are a bit harder, but actually it balances, you have more benefits than disbenefits.
I love that, whether the world is going to end if things change. One of the things that I'm wondering as a communications person, and it kind of goes to the culture, and we can get into this more later, but I'm kind of wondering the conversion stories. So say there's a person who lives in a London borough that's not used to this, right? And they go, oh no, they do that in Hackney, etc. Have you, and this maybe deeply, you can tell me about your research, conversion stories. Like, what if this guy who only drove or only whatever, did he go on a little e-bike ride in Hackney one day and then realize? Do you have any kind of interesting stories about that?
I mean, it is an area that I would certainly like to do more research into, because I think those narratives are really important, of how people experience change and how people, and there are definitely quite a lot of examples that I've come across more anecdotally about people, and I think it's quite, in those experiences that people have told me about, I think having, people who are your peers, or people who whose experiences, whose arguments you trust, or people who you think could be like you, which I think is really important. People need to sort of see and hear from people who they think are like themselves, not the traditional cyclist who maybe they don't identify with, but people who they can imagine as doing things that they might do themselves. And I remember actually I had a student who was studying attitudes and barriers to cycling among the Black community in Camden in North London, and there's something she said, something that came out of her study really stuck in my head, and it was a woman sort of saying, who'd never considered cycling, but then when pushed to think about, well, what might encourage her to cycle, or who's what kind of stories might encourage her to cycle, she sort of said, well, if the past pastor cycled to church, to give a sermon, then I would think about it. And, so those role models, may be different for different groups and different people and so on. But I think a message about thinking about, different places, different communities, different examples. And I certainly know of stories from London that are slightly more general around the impact that getting a group of counsellors to go on a bike ride is sometimes made. So inviting them to come and sort of see and to experience what it's like. And it's very easy for people to see, before you experience it yourself. And I have a sort of anecdote story for that as well. It would just, being sat in the car with my mum. She was driving around Lancashire where my family live. And I remember pointing, because I'm a very boring passenger. I kind of chunt her and I'm like, oh, look at that bike lane. That's awful. And my mum sort of said, what's wrong with it? And I said, well, Mum, would you cycle in that bike lane? She said, of course I wouldn't cycle in that bike lane. It's kind of like, well, that's the problem with it then, is that you wouldn't cycle in it. So I think when people sort of actually think about or try and do cycling or walking in an environment, discover some of those issues, I think that could be helpful as well. So potentially some of those events with decision makers, I think, have been quite influential.
Thank you. You walked right into my trap, which is, I think that, one of my things is this idea of climate influence. And I always refer to Anne Hidalgo in Paris. She's out there riding a bike. She's got this political will. And the other thing from my perspective is that she gets a lot of really positive buzz internationally just for being kind of the hip, cool mayor. How can we be leveraging that, And it also kind of goes back right now to those stories about trying to get people to get their COVID vaccinations, right? And who is the person that's going to influence them? I think there was a story from Israel about rabbis who helped, once the rabbis were convinced, then their communities were like, oh, okay, I'm in. So you did walk into my trap. But I think that the whole idea of climate influence and getting, I even look at cities like Seattle, getting the mayor, and whoever is mayor, we're in the middle of an election period, getting the mayor to ride a bike. And again, I guess when I say bike, it could be either, but I think now more and more people really think it's accessible if we're talking about e-bikes. But when I say bike, I just mean whatever. But getting people to try a bike, to ride a short trip in their actual city, they'll vote different. The power in that is incredible. So that's really what I focus on, is climate influence and how really to get decision makers to ride a bike in their city for like a day, maybe an hour. And then it really changes stuff. I think there's a ton of potential there.
Yeah. And I think also the sort of the influence of mayors and city leaders internationally. I mean, some of those, the sort of knowledge sharing and the learning, and sometimes for me, some of the things that inspire me most are not, the traditional high performers in terms of walking and cycling and so on. But yeah, exactly like Anne Hidalgo in Paris, which has not traditionally been bike friendly, or some Latin American cities where, again, traditionally not very high levels of cycling, hostile environments where, they've made that substantial change. And okay, it doesn't quite look like Copenhagen yet. The change they've made is inspiring.
Yeah, and it's like immediately apparent that the citizens are like, oh, this is kind of fun, or I like this. So what the resistance, and then you get whoever the resistant, and I like, talking about it as a hostile environment, because it really can be. And then it's just like, okay, who are the three people we need to give this experience to who could potentially make a change? And maybe one is the mayor. I love this quote. I wanted to talk about, dig into research that you did on why culture matters for transport policy. And you did this research with Katrina Youngnickel. Did I pronounce that right?
Yes.
The quote just from the abstract was this: our research highlights the embedding of transport in local as well as national cultures and the associated need for policymakers to take culture seriously in considering how to shift transport practices. So, and I guess this is more of the same. I don't know if you're thinking, what do you think has made the difference, and how did the culture you study at least start to roll in that direction?
This was our cycling culture study, where we were looking at sort of cycling cultures, policies, experiences, and so on in 4 English contexts where cycling levels were relatively high, in a wider context where they're really pretty low. And one of the things that we did, slightly negatively find, was that there was still a lot of barriers, there was still a lot of problems, even in those contexts. And one of the things that was kind of protective in those contexts, when, people wouldn't say, oh, England is a cycling country in the same way they would the Netherlands is a cycling country or Denmark is a cycling country. So people didn't have that kind of national level culture thing to that they could hold on to in the same way you could in the Netherlands, say. So one of the things that they held on to was this kind of local distinctiveness narrative, which, in Cambridge, especially, for instance, where Cambridge is somewhere that has, 1 in 3 people cycle to work. It's very, it's a very distinctive place within England, and you visit it. And I visited it quite early on in doing research and cycling, and I was kind of like, wow, this is incredible. I hadn't been to the Netherlands at that point, and it was really interesting. And somewhere like Hackney was different again, or Hackney or Bristol, a couple of other places in the study, because those were places where cycling had increased relatively recently, and yet there was also a narrative about it being somehow linked to a specific, the specific characteristics of Hackney or of Bristol in terms of being sort of, bit green, alternative, and so on. So, which is interesting. But then again, you have to remember the kind of exclusions that those kind of narratives come with, and the way in which they are, they attract some people and not others. So it's not unproblematic. On the other hand, Hull, which was our 4th place that we studied. So Hull has a long tradition of cycling as well, but it was in decline when we were studying it. It was slightly sad because it was seen as something from the past, something of Hull's past. And I remember one interviewer saying to me, in the past, people would cycle, but now, everyone has a car, the wife has a car, the kids have a car, there's cars everywhere. And so the narrative has sort of had cycling as part of Hull's past, really, which is something that, potentially is a resource that you could use to turn around, because also people did see Hull as linked to a culture of cycling, but it was narrated differently. So I guess part of the point is that a lot of places you do have those kind of resources that you can draw on, and you can say, well, cycling is part of our culture here, linked, and there's these distinctive aspects to it, and it could be seen in a range of different ways. But I guess also, it is something that is a little bit defensive, because you are still saying within this wider context where people don't cycle, this is our little part of cycling heaven, or cycling futures.
I really love your distinction of is London a cycling city, or the local distinctiveness. What did you call it, a factor or local distinctiveness? Talking about it that way is really interesting, because I haven't been to London in years and whatever. I'm very involved in kind of music and the plant-based and whatever. And all I know is when my music friends they go to Hackney, right? Or I really love bands from Bristol. And I think that just making these broad statements and just like pairing this local distinctiveness is interesting, because then you can look at it and go, I think you can tell me as a researcher, you could look at it and go, okay, is there a really resistant neighborhood right next to Hackney, right? That could sort of, you can edge into this or whatever. That's something that strikes me. But I love not just doing this blanket thing, London isn't a cycling city, or just diving into specific areas and then maybe leveraging that influentially.
Yes, I mean, it's also, I suppose there is also that tension between, if you're thinking that there's some areas that are, then that implies that there are some areas that aren't. And I guess important to think about what we need to do to diversify it, to make it accessible to everyone. So, for instance, if people need a standard traditional 2-wheeled bike, then, for many people, that's not that large an amount of money. But if you need a cargo bike to carry kids, or an adapted cycle, an e-bike, then that you're talking about really quite a different cost that can be prohibitive for a lot of people, so that they may not feel included.
Yeah, thank you. So interesting. So with regard to Bikes for Climate, which is the kind of the tag that I started and I curate, I tend to argue that we need more of those leaders like Anne Hidalgo, who's boldly cycling and doing that. In your research, or have you done anything about kind of the political, or those counselors or people being involved in that and kind of being more bold in making decisions about transportation?
I mean, we've done some sort of on the flip side, we did some research looking at sort of barriers to investing in cycling. So what were the barriers that were local practitioners, local policymakers and so on felt in terms of cycling being invested in, or often not being invested in? And one of the top barriers, funding was obviously very important, and funding is still something that authorities here are, really active travel funding is still far too scarce, but also local political will was really important, because you don't necessarily need a lot of money. Some things, particularly if you're doing something on a temporary trial basis, you can maybe use light segregation if you're building a cycle route, sort of temporary rubber blocks, curbs and so on. So, you don't necessarily need to spend a lot of money. But if you didn't have the political will to reallocate road space, whether it's creating protected cycle lanes or it's creating a safe crossing for pedestrians, that could just block everything. So having that local political support, and, unfortunately that does make a lot of things quite vulnerable, because, sometimes sometimes that key person would move on, and then the project that they'd been supporting, the project that they'd been spending their evenings working on, would just sort of fall away. So I think absolutely crucial in having someone, particularly when as well there's a lot of really talented transport planners and engineers, but sort of the traditions of transport planning, modelling and engineering are often not that supportive. And it's for to be that local political leader who pushes and who doesn't accept, oh no, it's not safe. Why is it not safe? Because we've always done it the other way, and we don't, to actually not accept excuses, and to really push for things to be done differently and better, even if that isn't the way we've traditionally done things. And that's kind of hard. And often, if you're talking about, say, portfolio holders, so councillors in this country who would have the transport portfolio, they're not necessarily experts in transport. Why would they be? And they need, I think, getting them to understand why building transformation active travel is important and what it means, and not to be sidetracked by reasons why you can't do it, is really important.
Does your research, how does what you're doing, because what you're doing is so in depth, and you've got what's happening, and your findings are all really helpful, I think. How does what you're doing finally reach the right person? Are there obstruction? How do you finally reach the person who's the decision maker? And who is that decision maker? It's not necessarily the mayor, right? It's the person whispering into the mayor's ear. So can you tell me a little bit about that?
It's often, I'm not necessarily the person communicating research directly, so potentially it's people in local areas who would hear about the research, my research, or other people's research, and would then potentially translate it to decision makers. So sometimes, it might be local officers who might hear about research findings and who might sort of summarise and share the results of those findings. I think it does vary in different local areas. I think, sometimes it is the leader of a council, the mayor, whatever, who pushes through, building higher quality cycle tracks. They're really personally committed to it, they believe in it, and so there's an example in Leicester where they basically removed, the mayor was strongly behind reallocating carriageway space on a ring road towards protected cycle tracks. And despite the fact that there were arguments that, well, you can't possibly take a lane away from motor traffic, the sky will fall in, and nevertheless he persevered with it. And they've built quite a lot of temporary COVID era cycle tracks now by reallocating space and connecting, say, the hospital with residential areas, so that people could cycle to work. So sometimes it is a mayor, sometimes, but other times there's been other examples where it's, for instance, it might be somebody who is the transport portfolio holder, they're the person with that brief, and sometimes you can't have a hostile mayor or council leader or whatever, but it's somebody who steps back and who gives that person their trust and who lets them run with it and who's willing to support them. So I think it just varies. And I think for me, communicating, I do communicate my research directly quite a lot as well, but I think often it is people talking about research, my research, other people's research, and sort of communicating and sharing findings, through networks and so on. But I've certainly done talks on research to local authority officers, to politicians and policymakers, and so on as well. So I think it's important for researchers to get that out directly, but I think a lot of sharing of knowledge, sort of probably happens without the original researcher as well.
Yeah, so it's important. That kind of makes me think that it is important, even though if on Twitter we feel like we're just sort of, tweeting out to the wilderness. One of the things I like to do is just say, I use that hashtag Bike Twitter, and I go, hey, new research from Rachel or whatever. And also I feel like, and we can talk about this, I don't know what your feelings are, but it just seems like there's so much more research happening UK, EU, and I don't know why it's not happening here, or it isn't a priority or whatever, but it's just like I keep finding that I'm highlighting what's going on in the EU and what's going on in the UK as any hope, right, of supplying resources or generating some buzz with US decision makers, including we have sustainability directors that are in each city, or somebody who might be with a Bloomberg program on American cities. It's really about climate.
I think being able to share research on social media, I use Twitter quite a bit as well to sort of share not just my own research, but other people's research as well. And I think it particularly helps when research is open access, so that people can, anybody can read it as well. That's, the academic publishing model there's a lot of problems with it, researchers don't always have the funds to make research open access, but ideally it would be so that people can read, can go and read the research. Although also, it's not everyone is going to read a full academic article. So I think it's also important. I think Twitter threads can be quite helpful as well. I sometimes do that for an article, like potentially, 10 tweets all strung together can be quite useful.
I firmly believe that. Half the time I tell people, who I might be advising, I'm like, listen, share it as a Twitter thread, because then that, in a way, if you want to, that itself could just be pasted in and be a LinkedIn article, right? Like, figure out ways. I mean, you repeat these things over and over again, right? And you have all these abstracts and you're like, I don't want to do this again, but I think Twitter threads are amazing, even for sorting your thinking in terms of writing and stuff. I am cynical about social media broadly, but I feel like Twitter and potentially LinkedIn, because there are researchers in transportation and cycling advocates who are hungry for stuff that they can just funnel through to their leaders and their council people and their mayors. Yeah, I think it's powerful, and I'm really glad that you're on there.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes it's not always 100% fun, but I think it is. No, I think it's important to be there and to be sharing stuff, and particularly, potentially amplifying other researchers whose work isn't well enough known and who are doing some really great stuff. So.
Yeah, it's funny it feels like sometimes academics who are doing a pretty good job on Twitter might be a little bit harder to find. Like, the fact that you do it is a pretty big deal, and the fact that you do it pretty well. And it's like, how can that be trained into academia so that professors and the researchers coming up know to leverage that? Because I love to be able to really get Twitter rallied around new research or something that could help. And so we need more people like you to actually be on Twitter telling us about it. So one of the things that we read about a little bit in London that I'm not super clear about is just this idea of the low traffic neighborhood. And I believe you've done some significant work on that. Can you tell me about that? And I guess, kind of interestingly, as a way to bridge it, because sorry, I'm backing up on the question, but I was on a kind of a social media call with a guy who was a council person kind of in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And he said he's finding that his peers don't respond to, we need safe streets, They respond to complete networks. And it makes me think that low traffic neighborhoods is a way to bring in this. So tell me a lot about low traffic neighborhoods.
Sure. I mean, there's lots of debates here about what terms to use and so on. And one argument that people make is that the problem with that term is that it's negative and it highlights what you don't have as opposed to what you do have anyway. These are kind of ongoing discussions. And I guess when you've got potentially controversial policies, there probably isn't an ideal term to be used to describe them. But basically, I mean, I guess the interesting thing for me about low traffic neighborhoods is that it is a sort of area level thing. So it's not just about an individual slow street or complete street or whatever. The focus is on a neighbourhood and on trying to reduce, substantially remove through motor traffic from that neighbourhood using techniques that I think, very often modal filters, which restrict motor vehicles from going through, sometimes like diverters as well. So you can turn left in a motor vehicle or right in a motor vehicle, but you can't go straight on. Quite a lot of examples of there from some of the greenways, I think, in North America, where they use those kind of things. But yeah, the idea that you get a neighbourhood where you can access any property within the neighbourhood by car, but you can't just cut through it to somewhere else. And part of the problem that we've been having in London and many other UK cities is that with the rise of sat-nav, the rise of home deliveries and so on, that a lot of those neighbourhood streets have got very, very busy with motor traffic, and people, find intimidating walking or cycling in those neighbourhoods. So that's the idea behind it. There's a number of studies that we've now been able to do looking at some of the impacts in London, partly because during 2020, a lot of these things were put in as temporary, emergency measures effectively during COVID. And I'd have to say London, didn't really do as well in terms of cycle tracks as say Paris did or Bogota did as temporary COVID interventions, but London did put in quite a few of these low traffic neighbourhoods. So we've been able to look at some of those impacts. Also longer term schemes that have gone in Waltham Forest. So as part of a mayoral programme called Mini Hollands, Waltham Forest have put in some of these kind of schemes from 2015, 2016 onwards. They weren't called low traffic neighbourhoods then, they were called village schemes initially. And then, things are called different names. Livable neighbourhoods is another popular term. So yeah, we've looked at their impacts, and it seems, it's still something's still a little provisional because, at the moment this is just London that we've looked at, and also, some of these things haven't been in that long. But we're finding big increases in walking, particularly. We're finding reduction in car ownership and use. We're finding a reduction in street crime, which is interesting, and we're finding a reduction in road injuries as well, particularly it seems for pedestrians. So, it seems like there's a range of, positive impacts that we've been able to measure.
It's so exciting again to just even have the research. But I feel like we, even during COVID here in Seattle, had, I think it's called Stay Healthy Streets. And even that it's just really interesting. It gives drivers, I think, driving through the neighborhood more of a perspective that maybe they'll take with them elsewhere, but also is an immediate demonstration of, oh yeah, this is kind of like that thing that I liked when I went on that trip to Europe, But part of the low traffic neighborhoods idea, you mentioned it with regard to deliveries, how much the e-commerce and the deliveries has just taken over every city street. And I do some kind of work on that with a colleague up in Vancouver, BC. And that idea of psychologistics, I'm always thinking, what will a city or transportation system put budget toward? I'm cynical in a way. I think they're like, well, people can just deal, they can, put high visibility stuff on and walk carefully on the sidewalks. They'll just have to deal with cars. But it seems to me that potentially, and I'd love to hear your thoughts, dialing into psychologistics or delivering by e-cargo, bike and trailer, et cetera, is something that has commerce attached to it, right? And money and saving, like that may get kind of decision makers' heads thinking about it faster than I believe what they think about when you talk about getting more people to ride bikes and walk safely is just sort of Saturday afternoon walking around. It's like they don't visualize it as the everyday thing in the city. So I guess, yeah, I'm interested in last mile delivery and what you think will make people pay more attention to this and the budget involved in that and just sort of anything on that conversation.
Yeah, that is a really interesting area. I've been recently doing a bit of work with my colleagues, Celia Verlinghieri and Irene Areta, with a company called Pedal Me as well, looking at shifting deliveries from van to cargo bike and the potential efficiency and environmental impacts of that. And I think this has been quite a neglected area, but there's a lot of scope for many of these, for really quite substantial system change. So I think it's one of these things that needs a push. It's not necessarily, the current system is inefficient, but it's not necessarily going to change by itself. And certainly as a customers ordering items don't have a choice, even if that would make a difference, which arguably, that's not where you where you would start to make a difference. But yeah, it's kind of a system that is out of people's hands. And we have started to see some interesting things happening in London, particularly, I think, around this as well. So City of London, which is like the square mile, is starting to set up these delivery hubs, which are the idea is the vans come in and they drop off, and then you have sort of e-cargo bikes, or it might be a person with a trolley, or it might be potentially a small electric vehicle would then take on and deliver those things. So we are seeing sort of more of this. And I think, being able to incentivize this and disincentivize van use and being able to support businesses to make a change is really important. But there are a lot of benefits. And I think it also goes together with the infrastructure potentially, so that if you have infrastructure that makes it easier to cycle, makes cycling the quicker, the better alternative to driving a van, then, that will also help. And we found that potentially when we looked at some of these routes in London for vans versus cargo bikes, you could see examples of where, because a street had been modally filtered and, you couldn't drive down that street, but you could cycle through it, then that may, helped make that cargo bike delivery even more efficient. Of course, it does mean you have to think about the design. So one problem we traditionally have here is that bollards are put too close together and you can't get a bike trailer through the bollard. Yeah, I think that's possibly, a problem that you may experience too. But just, the planning aspect and the thinking of those slightly wider cycles rather than just thinking about somebody on a two-wheel bike without a load.
Well, I mean, kind of where you start, though, it's interesting because it's like we are starting to see infrastructure and decisions like this being made around just regular people cycling. But it does seem to me that there gets to be a little bit more enthusiasm and interest once you dig. It's like, which is first, the chicken or the egg? It's like, should we also then be really pushing last mile delivery and psychologistics in these hubs? Because ultimately it will help the average person be able to cycle. You know what I mean? I'm trying to figure out what works faster, pushing the business button and going, you're losing money, you're being so inefficient, figure this out. And then having the infrastructure that's developed for that be super helpful for people, because in my very cynical mind, getting more people cycling safely doesn't seem to be quickly motivating.
Yeah, I guess it depends on the context. It depends. Different things. One of the things that I think potentially we got confused about here was around the motivation of health in relation to cycling. And I don't think that health is necessarily, the motivator that is important for individuals. But if for some policymakers thinking about population health and thinking about the scope that improving the health of the population could be quite important. So, I guess different messages and different motivators potentially.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Like individuals don't think on a day-to-day basis about kind of the health, but the money kind of and the community and looking at public health broadly by policymakers that can get, I'm constantly looking for what's sexier for the decision makers, right? What's going to be more urgent for the decision makers. It's so interesting. And then the other thing I was kind of interested in, just more, you'd mentioned on your website that you're this active travel academy. Tell us a little bit about that and what you're doing with that and what's been successful and kind of exciting.
Yeah, so this is quite exciting for me because we got funding from the Quintin Hogg Trust, which is the University of Westminster's linked charity, to set up the Active Travel Academy and basically be a research knowledge exchange teaching hub focused around active travel. So very exciting to be working with some great colleagues. We've got a lot of brilliant PhD students who are doing some amazing projects. So for instance, we've got a PhD student who's studying the impact of school streets in London, looking at the impact, both on travel to school, but also looking at how space is used, which is really, really interesting. So yeah, lots of great projects. We also have a lot of events, and at the moment, obviously events are largely virtual. So that gives an opportunity to reach a wider audience potentially. And my colleague Tom Cohen, he's part of the Active Travel Academy, organises with other colleagues walking at tea time and cycling at tea time, which are or meal time even. It's not always tea time, but basically organises these great events. And of course we can share, can then make that material available afterwards. We also work with the journalist Laura Laker. We've worked with her and she's led the development of these road collision reporting guidelines, which is around trying to encourage news reporting to report better on particularly vulnerable road user fatalities, collisions involving pedestrians and cyclists and so on, where potentially the way that collisions are reported can lead to people sort of blaming the victim and so on. So there's a whole range of stuff we're involved in, a range of different research projects. One of our interests is around evaluating the impact of some of these schemes that are going in, so we've got ongoing work around that. So lots of stuff, and it's just really great to be working with some brilliant colleagues, brilliant students, and just be able to amplify some of the stuff that they're leading, like Acilia and Irina's work on cargo bikes, which is just fantastic. So
oh my gosh, that is incredibly exciting. I mean, the two things from my perspective, the school street stuff, right? And I'm not a parent, but I live in a neighborhood that's just like, right? It becomes minivans all the way around the school for like a mile. And that, that is last mile delivery, right? So it is almost right of people and products. So I also think that the psychologistics kind of getting more into e-cargo bikes and kind of studying that would then be really easy to like apply and put pressure on people with regard to school drop off. I think that's really interesting. And the other thing that you said that is super great is Laura Laker's like helping the media figure out and get better trained, it sounds like, to use better words and to phrase things based on the crash or the rider or that's really, really interesting. So can you tell me anything more about what Laura Laker's up to?
Yeah, so the guidelines it's been something in progress over a few months, and we recently released the final version. Well, I say final, but this is something that is potentially something that will develop over time as well. But avoiding the word accident we see as really important, in line with like guidance from World Health Organization, British Medical Association, a whole range of organizations. The Met Police in London avoid using it now. So really accident as just it kind of implies something unavoidable that's just happens, and really important to avoid that kind of language. And we also talked about the fact that very often when collisions are talked about, it's the car is described as being the actor.
Oh yes,
the car they hit by a car was speeding, a car was doing this, and it's actually when it's actually a driver doing it. And it's interesting, one interesting thing is when there's an incident involving a person on a bike, suddenly it tends to change, and if something happens, the cyclist did this rather than the bicycle, or the cycle did this. And so I think in a sense perhaps you have a model in terms of how cycling, how things involving a cyclist are reported. But very often when something involving a car driver is reported, it is described as if the car did something, and yet obviously these these cars are not generally autonomous cars. There is a driver. So these kind of things. And one of the things that influenced us in developing these was work by researchers including Tara Goddard and Kelsey Ralph, who've done some really great stuff around the reporting, the way in which it's similar in North America as well. It's actually similar in in other European countries, as far as I can tell, some of these patterns. And yeah, it doesn't help. It doesn't help people actually think about the causes of crashes and collisions and how, we might be able to stop these deaths and serious injuries. I think it's very often kind of, the accidents that just happen, but that's not the case. We can stop this happening.
I love that, and I'm going to definitely look that up, and I might pull it out and add that link, especially in the show notes. But it actually reminds me, there's a kind of an initiative or a program out of Columbia Journalism School here called Covering Climate Now. It's one of those things, right? It's a resource in this education. I think it's really geared toward educating journalists, to change. But I attend a lot of their webinars, and I'm just like, this is a really interesting information for communications pros, because I feel like even communications professionals rather, can start to, if they change the way they're wording, then maybe if a journalist is reading more of their work, they'll just sort of take the hint. You know what I mean? I think it's a whole process. So that Covering Climate Now is really interesting. Did you have anything else to add on that?
Yeah, no, I mean, that sounds a great resource. And I think, the language of these things really matters. And also that's a good point that it's not just, often one point that was made to us was that journalists sometimes are basically using the same language that is used in police reports, police press releases and so on. So it's important also to ensure that changes. So yeah, I mean, it's a whole, I mean, it is something that's more widespread generally through society. So I guess you have to have different strategies, but yeah, to ensure that we do represent things that happen, the crashes that happen, collisions that happen more accurately, and to try and, get more of a constructive debate happening about what we do about road injury risk.
Yeah, well, thank you. One last question is just sort of, are you seeing the transportation, kind of these changes in transportation connected well enough to climate action in your general sphere? Or do you feel kind of like you're doing your thing and climate action is over here and they don't really mesh as well in the kind of public conversation?
I mean, we have seen a spate of authorities here in the UK sort of acknowledge the climate emergency, which has been quite a positive development. But then that doesn't necessarily go hand in hand with, for instance, reviewing major road schemes, and actually that translating into practice. Sometimes it does. I just saw recently that in Wales they've launched a review of plans for major road schemes, and they're actually going to look at that in the light of the climate emergency. So that should be feeding through into policy. But very often it is kind of that the climate emergency is something over there, and the day-to-day kind of road, the way that things work on the road, transport policy doesn't necessarily change. And I think sometimes it's kind of hard for people to connect the two and to sort of see, that either the climate emergency is something sort of remote or far off or frightening that we can't do something about, rather than that there are steps that we can take that can make a difference. Obviously, it's not whatever, say, London or wherever it does is only one small thing, but it's all important. So, and I think one of the things that has been quite positive here as well has been sort of citizens' assemblies on climate, and some of these are focused specifically on transport, and actually getting representative group of citizens together to talk about the problems, talk about the solutions, talk about the compromises that need to be made. I mean, that is also quite exciting, and it's a way of, hopefully, if it's done well, getting people to think about the scale of the change, but also what could be done and what the co-benefits might be.
Yeah, co-benefits. That's like the word of the day for like everything that a lot of us are involved in. It's just like they're all connected, people. Well, thank you so much. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I'm looking forward to more of your research and your Twitter sharing, and just really glad that you're up to this in London, because we need it in the US. We need what you're up to in order to do anything here. So thank you so much for your time. And have a great rest of your week and summer, and we will be in touch, and I'll see you on Twitter.